surprise, e-recording doesn't mean instant. There is still a physical person on the other side of that computer within the Register of Deeds that is processing that recording if you are in North Carolina. So if the Register of Deeds is closed, what does that mean? Your deed or deed of trust is not recording. So today, Layla Rogers and I, Tiffany Weber, both attorneys with Thomas & Weber, break down the things that you need to consider if you have a closing and the Register of Deeds is closed. Today, we're going to get into how do closings continue when there is a severe weather event. And I guess technically not just a weather event, but any event that causes our major services needed to conduct a closing to go down. Do you remember a couple of years ago when all of the Register of Deeds got hacked?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and we were all driving to the courthouse to do title searches and everything. At least we were able to record, but man, that was a tough couple months there, 6 to 8 weeks. But we just went through in our counties lots of Register of Deeds closures. So, you were mentioning all of these things to consider if the Register of Deeds is down. That doesn't necessarily mean you don't have to proceed or there aren't special things to think about in closing. So what do you have today for us?
Sure, yeah. So I would say first off that, if there is inclement weather that's forecasted, as soon as you see that schools are starting to close, that's when I get a little tense. Mm-hmm. And I think, okay, I'm going to start checking out the Register of Deeds websites to see what their reaction is going to be and if they are going to close. So recently, we had Register of Deeds closures on a Thursday around 4:30, mm-hmm. so real late in the day, with closings the following day. Mm-hmm. So the real question becomes, are we going to keep our signing appointments or not? Mm-hmm. Because there is this misconception, and I'll tackle this one right up front. Even though in a lot of situations we do record electronically, mm-hmm. Basically you're just standing in a virtual line. And there are still folks at Register of Deeds that are working mm-hmm. to record your documents. So even though we e-record, that doesn't mean that we will be able to record if the Register of Deeds is closed.
I think of it like e-record is kind of, at least in North Carolina, kind of like email, glorified email system for us to send the documents that someone has to read and look at and approve, and they get to it in a line just like you do when you check your emails. So I'm so glad you brought that up. That's a big one.
Right. So then the next question is, once we know Register of Deeds is closed, is are we going to keep our signing appointments?
Yeah.
So, and there can be implications either way mm-hmm. With whatever you decide to do. So first of all, contact the parties, see if everyone feels safe mm-hmm. and does want to continue and try and do the signing appointment. But if we do sign and Register of Deeds is closed, the recording would be delayed until the next business day that ROD would be open. Mm-hmm. So even though technically the lender documents all will say closing date on X day, the property won't actually legally transfer until the moment that the deed is recorded.
Yeah. That's, spoiler alert, we kept our appointments on, but with input from the parties, it wasn't you're coming to your closing and that's that. It's not like that at all. It's, but after weighing all of the factors, people were coming in and we were still doing closings. And we had, there's one closing I did on that day where the sellers were really a bit confused. They were like, okay, so, if they've signed their loan documents, this is done. So, in what sense? Tell me, what do you understand done to mean? And they thought they were getting paid. They thought they were going to get money on that day. And I said, you're not getting money until the deed records. They're like, well, if their Register of Deeds is closed, then how does it record today? It does. It was you had to walk backwards and explain how everything falls in line. So, it's the communication aspect between agent and client is so important of helping them understand. You're not getting your money yet.
Right. And don't cancel your homeowner's insurance.
Right.
So that was something that we talked about a lot at the closing table at mm-hmm. my closings that day. And then something else to think about too is that in the situation in our situation, it was a Friday. My buyers were planning on moving in over the weekend. And so we were able to talk about and get in place a buyer possession agreement before closing. So technically, even though they didn't own the property yet, because it wouldn't record till Monday, they were still able to get into that property.
Yeah, and that's, we're not seeing as many buyer possession agreements as we were during COVID time, or seller possession as we were during COVID time, because it was a little bit chaotic. But so I think it can often be forgotten that that's a tool at disposal, and it exists for a reason. It's for situations kind of like this where a delay might happen that is outside of the party's control, but possessions, it has been contemplated will happen on a certain day. So we had one where they took possession on that Friday as well, and the parties were kind of like, well, what's the point? I'm telling our client, I wouldn't do it. I would not take possession of this property without the buyer possession or some agreement. I would not step foot in there. I would not move the first thing until there's been memorialized what each party is responsible for, because and you still got the issue of a stormy weekend and someone else owns the house that you're living in. I mean, if something happens, if a tree falls on your house, who's in charge of that? Which you had that happen.
Right, I did. So interestingly, the storm passed over Charlotte in the early morning of Friday, and our closing was scheduled for 10 a.m. And at 9 a.m., the buyers had their final walkthrough, but couldn't even access the property because a tree had fallen onto the property. Luckily, not on the house.
Oh, thank goodness.
But it was tangled in electrical lines around the property, and they couldn't get in. So we, got to the closing table and, put our heads together. And there are a couple things that you can do in that situation. If there are concerns about damage to a property and making sure that gets rectified. One thing that you can do is enter into a written agreement with the seller where they will say, yes, we will take care of this damage. The only downside to that is really the only way to enforce it would be through litigation should they not comply. The other thing is, examining the damage and coming up with some sort of estimate as to how much it may cost to fix it. And then doing an escrow holdback, so holding back some of the seller's funds pending that being resolved. But
which
again, that's
a lender would have to approve, right?
Right, exactly.
You were probably about to say that. Sorry.
So there are a couple of things that you can do. In my particular situation, the rapport between buyers and sellers, it was very good. Because the tree was tangled in power lines, there was discussion about how Duke Energy would likely be taking care of the bulk of that problem. And really, the buyers just said, okay, well, let's just go ahead and do the written agreement. We understand how there could still be some exposure, but we're comfortable moving forward. And since we didn't have internet, we just ended up handwriting it.
Yes,
so you do what you have to do it in these situations.
I couldn't believe it when you mentioned that, oh, and by the way, we also don't have internet here now. I'm like, oh man, I'm so sorry.
I mean, it was something, but I was happy for the buyers that we were still able to have their closing appointment because, in the event that you do delay, I know in their particular case, there would have been some issues with their rate lock expiring. So we really wanted to get it done for them.
And that's another thing that I'm so glad you brought up the rate lock is, sometimes when delays are happening, the agents maybe aren't considering that the buyer's rate is about to expire. And there might be opportunities for lenders to have some give in there, but not always. So if you're not, this is a team effort. You're going to have to bring everybody into the discussion to make sure, one, can we push it? If we don't sign these documents on this day, is their rate going up a point? Because that's a very big deal. And then if we got to hold some money back, is the lender going to allow it? If not, we're going to have to come up with something else. And then, talking about whose responsibility is it if something happens. In North Carolina, I think we're very lucky in our forms address a lot of situations, including the risk of loss during the pendency of the closing, and who's responsible to take care of what. I don't know if it's like this in all states, but, in North Carolina, the owner of the property is responsible. And until that deed is recorded, the seller is the owner of the property. So that buyer possession and some of these other agreements that if you're going to allow someone to move into property that you still own, the buyer possession addresses some things, kind of like a residential lease that you would want addressed, because we may not always know the length of the delay. We don't know when Register of Deeds is going to come back up,
right?
Even though we hope it's very soon. Did you have anything else on your list?
Well, one other thing that came to mind is several years ago for Hurricane Ian, I recall that we had several closings on the books that we ended up not being able to close, and I think we're delayed up to a week. Just because when there are natural disasters, some of the homeowners insurance carriers will freeze issuing new policies.
Yes.
Pending investigations and that type of thing.
Yeah.
So just
that's a
something
good
else
one.
to
I didn't
keep in
think about
mind.
that at all. We did have a new construction, and Megan in our office also mentioned this, that we're already starting to see in loan packages very quickly after this natural disaster. On the Friday, the lender wouldn't close. They would not fund the loan until a representative from their organization had visited the property in person to verify that it was still in condition, basically lendable condition. Is it still worth what we said we would loan to you? And thankfully, this lender had boots on the ground locally, but depending on what lender you're working with, that might not be true. It might not be possible for them to have a person within their organization or that they have employed or contracted with to get there on the same day. But having re-inspections or reappraisals, at least the drive-by type, to make sure that the property's still standing is certainly coming up more often than it has in the past.
Yeah, I think we'll still be seeing those additional disclosures in the packages here for some time.
Yeah.
One of that I've seen recently is a lender hold harmless, depending on if the property has been affected by the natural disaster, that they are not taking responsibility.
Yeah.
And the buyer's accepting the property as it is in its current condition. And in the situation where they can't get someone to come and inspect it before closing, buyers are signing releases saying, yes, if you notify me and give me reasonable notice that, I will let someone come on the property and inspect it if the lender so chooses to do that.
Yeah, that's, for lack of a better term, all of the CYA dogs, right?
Right.
The inspections and the occupancy, the buyer possession, one of the things in there is that if you move in, you're accepting it as its current condition. And all of those things that the contract gives you rights about the property being same or better condition as when you went under contract, that is done. That's over with. So, you got to counsel the buyers that you're moving in the middle of a storm or whatever it may be. So the second you occupy, you're taking it in its condition. So if that condition worsens, it's not going to be same or better, but you've already taken that risk. So that's one of the things, some of the conversations we're having to have in these scenarios. Wild stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But the number one thing, e-recording. Just remember what Layla said at the top of this about e-recording. It's just a huge misconception. So I'll tell people in closings, they'll say, do you e-record? And I say, we do whichever is fastest. And they say, well, how could e-recording not be the fastest? It's instant. And so that's an education moment of no.
It's still a line, whether it be in person or virtual.
Yeah.
There's
and sometimes
always a line.
The in-person line, depending on how the Register of Deeds staff, there might be a certain staff person assigned to e-recording, a certain staff person assigned to in-person recordings, and that in-person recording line might be non-existent. So we could get over there in 15 minutes and, get it on record, where the e-recording line is 100 long. We just have to assess based on the situation. So but I get a lot of puzzled looks of, what do you mean whatever is fastest? It's obviously e-recording. Maybe. But thank you so much. When we were talking about all of the things to consider when the Register of Deeds is down, I think that's a super comprehensive list, and thanks for putting it together for us.